All right, hello, and welcome to another episode of Embracing Differences with Jenny, Craig, Rob, and myself, Nipin. You may recall that we did a session a couple of weeks ago, which is called Following Leading in Risk. And we discussed where we are with a lot of leadership models, the way it is taught, the whole discourse around leadership, which is caught in the what as Craig very beautifully articulated in the hero myth, which is that we give a lot of power and attribution to one person, the top leader, and as if they are the ones who are behind all the success. And then the other thing we discussed was that a complete absence of the feminist ethics in the following leading in the leadership discourse as leadership is taught today. Today, we look at the following leading model and a book that both Craig and Rob have written. And I have the book here in front of me. It's called Following Leading in Risk, a Humanizing Dynamic. And it's everything in this book, including the title, the subtitle, the images, the icons, everything is significant. And we will discuss that as we go. So let's start with this conversation. What is this whole idea of following leading? Craig, what are your thoughts? And then we will all give it our own perspective. Yeah.
Well, it was something that came out when Rob and I were first talking about leadership. So for my company, I do a lot of work in the leadership area, and I'm used to needing to start with the terminology and the frameworks that people are used to. And so they're used to the very American individual, yeehaw, I'm a leader sort of stuff, and trying to get them to consider the other people and what they might have to offer is sort of, you would think it's obvious, but it's just really difficult to get them engaged. And when Rob and I were talking, he said, well, hang on, this whole boober, I, thou, the relationship between people is the critical bit. And I was, yep, absolutely. So we ended up coming up with this model, which in many ways you can put stuff into the model that relate to the relationships between people, whether they be leaders and followers or different types of expertise or whatever it is. But that's probably enough from me, and let Rob sort of fill it out a bit more.
You've got me switched on, Nip, and that's good. Yeah, I'm currently writing this supplement to the book, which Craig and I had some discussions about recently. And it's occurred to me that in the whole leadership, followership kind of agenda, there's no book on the market that actually joins the two together. There's lots of books on followership and there's lots of books on leadership, but there's nothing that pulls them together in the hyphen. Yeah, well, there you go. There's a book on followership, but there's no research on the market that says, in fact, following and leading are one. You can't have one without the other. Very much a Buber idea of I, thou. And so when we put a hyphen between two things, we no longer have two things. Grammatically, as a part of speech, when you put a hyphen between something, it's no longer one word joined together. The hyphen turns the two words into one word. It's considered a whole. So if I hyphenate something like I am a son-in-law or I have a mother-in-law, you hyphenate those things so they're one thing. It's not mother, in, and law. It's one whole person. I have a mother-in-law, but it's three words. And by putting together following and leading and joining with the hyphen, what we've really emphasized is the joining. And so what we've really emphasize, and this was done beautifully in Brian and Annetta's book on what they called real meeting, is if you imagine this hyphen is the space between me and Jenny, the question is, how much have I moved into that hyphen to meet Jenny? And how much has she moved into that hyphen to meet me? And so in the following and the leading, we actually have to leave our position of strength, whether we're leading, or leave our position of strength, which could be following, and come into that hyphen and meet. So we have to leave something behind, and we've now got something which is one thing. And I think the book we've written, Craig, when I've looked across the world of research, I haven't come across anyone that's done it yet and said, in fact, that these two things are not two things. They must be joined, they must be active, and they must be together. Yes, Craig.
So an equivalent for me is venues. So you would think venues where people meet would be designed for people to meet, but they're not. Usually they're crappy. But I ran into one venue called Dialogue, and it was literally based on what they called the third space, where you leave your own spaces and come into a communal space where you can have genuine dialogue. Not only did they have that, but for the first 6 months, they offered their venue for free as long as you gave them feedback about how best to interact. And things like, I said, well, basically, you've got crap coffee. So everyone's going to be leaving and trying to find a coffee shop. So they actually spent $30,000 on getting decent coffee machines in to do that. And I find that place is sort of the venue equivalent of our book. That, yes, there are lots of books on leadership and followership, and there are lots of venues, but that's the only venue I've ever run into that was focused on the hyphen, that was focused on how people meet, and everything was designed around that. So that's all.
Sorry.
It reminds me of church or a courtroom. You go into this place and there's no meeting at all. You're all lined up in a row and the magistrate sits out front or the clergy sits out front. There's no engagement, there's no connection, there's no joining of the space between, and there's no dialogue, and you get lectured by a person in front and you have all these people who receive, who are the followers. I think that makes a wonderful point, because a lot of people think, and conferences run like this as well, a lot of people think a wonderful conference is having a keynote speaker and 350 people sitting at chairs and tables, eating sweets and drinking tea. And they think somehow that's a learning experience. And of course, there's no meeting, there's no joining, there's no communication, there's no engagement. And yet that's a popular model.
Yeah, I'd love to hear Jenny's thought on this, but the one thing that comes to mind is when I was in India last year in December, and because it's such a community-based society, what you're saying is something that we take for granted. So when you're installing, for example, simple things like benches in the public park, you will always find at least two or three benches facing each other. And so it's an invitation, we call it affordances, for example. It's an invitation for people to come and sit together. It's a symbol that that's how things have always been. But what's also interesting is in the same park, you will find individual benches like you do in the Western world. So here you have an opportunity to sit on your own, introspect, reflect, whatever you want. But there's also an opportunity for you to sit around. And it's such a simple example. But what's interesting is that thought simply does not exist in many individualist societies. So I think community-based societies have always looked at leadership in that way. That it's always happens in relationships, something that we struggle in other societies, for instance. And I'd love to hear Jenny's thought, what she thinks about it.
Boy, my head is running. It's like a bubble machine on steroids right now. I often would tell leaders when they'd come to me and we'd do some coaching, and we'd often talk about this concept of leadership. And I said, so who are you leading? And because quite frankly, I'd say to them, who are you without your people? Who is a leader without people? Who is a leader with when no one's following? And what strikes me is in many other, not every, but in many other contexts, there is a recognition that there needs to be a coexistence, a co-inhabitation, a co-creation. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to the work context, and not in isolation, but at least in the work context, there seems to be this forgetfulness that people and the conditions in which they work in are interacting all the time, and yet we treat them as deeply independent. There is an assumption that an individual will perform irrespectively of the conditions that surround them. So there is a distinct absence of the hyphen, at least in the work context that I encounter. And if there is something of a hyphen, consider it a bridge. And people say, well, we need to meet in the middle. Over time, I've come to realize that there is no meeting in any middle. There is usually someone having to leave their spot completely to get to the other side. There is no meeting. So that's what strikes me in the conversation. There's this desire for people across all disciplines and even in the work context to be seen, to feel understood. And yet the context we work in the workspace, tends to assume that individuals and the conditions and the context around them are somehow independent. So fascinating.
Indeed. What are your thoughts, Craig, as you listen to Jenny?
Amen. It just sounds great. And I think what is coming up that all four of us have different but overlapping perspectives on the same thing. And you see that often Rob and I, we go into a place, we do some training, and you can see they already had a glimpse of that, but they didn't have any words for it or a model for it or whatever. And at one level, you're not teaching them something new. You're giving them the words and the model to articulate what they're recognizing. And some work that I'm just currently doing, one of the comments about this particular organization, when I asked them to compare it to other ones, and they said, look, it may not pay as much, but the people are real and they have your back and that they'll listen to you. And I thought, yeah, in terms of what we're talking about, that is an element of following leading, just in the sense of the reality of the relationship. Whereas their comment about other places was you were literally just a number. You're just a robot.
Yes, I think there's another thing there. I think a lot of people confuse the idea of the word itself. So I can have a meeting, and in fact, lots of people in organisations, their whole day is run on meetings, back-to-back meetings, and they say, well, I've had a meeting. Having meetings has nothing to do with meeting. And this is an important part of the book that Craig and I wrote. That little hyphen is about meeting, real meeting, not having a meeting, but about substantial, to human, to fallible connection between two people that actually doesn't have a word for it. That's why the hyphen has to be used. There is no word. There are some languages. The Hebrew language has a word. It's the word yada, Y-A-D-A, and it means to know. But even then, in that word, to know, I can say, I know Craig and I know Jenny. But that's very, very different when I say, I know my wife. So we really lack a word and meeting is a confused word. That's why the hyphen is actually incredibly powerful, because it's a joining thing. It's not a word. It's a part of grammatical action, and it joins me. So if I get my name, and I know people have got hyphenated names, and their name is Susie Barr Smith, and Susie keeps her maiden name and the name of her partner, and now it's one word. And you can't do that without the hyphen. And so I think, and I think in our next book, in the supplement, Craig, we're going to write a lot more about the power of the hyphen. I don't think we emphasized that enough in our first book, but it helps bring the point of meeting to the front.
I think others would disagree, Rob. A lot of people said, "What is it with the hyphen?" I think what we'll do
really?
is, explain more about why it matters.
Okay, all right. Maybe you're right. I get excited by it because I I think language is more important than we make, particularly in the world of risk and safety and the world of leadership. I see so much stuff that's spoken that is just nonsense language, like apparently everyone in risk and safety is a thought leader, and I just think, what the hell is a thought leader? And the stuff that I just heard on that podcast for the last 30 minutes was rubbish. There was no thought leading anywhere. So I get concerned that in leadership now, we're using lots of this nonsense language. And in the end, it makes language meaningless.
I'd love to hear Jenny. What do you think, Jenny, as you're listening to Rob and Craig? What are your thoughts? This whole idea of the hyphen.
I ever since I met Rob, there's always been a hyphen. There's always been a hyphen. And then when I read Buber, oh my gosh, did it open my eyes. All of a sudden I thought someone is speaking to something, and Rob's right. Someone is speaking to something that is so either misunderstood, so overlooked, or considered insignificant. For me, it was two things actually with Buber. The first thing, it was the shift from I and it, and then I, it, talking about what's the relationship that between I, it, and then changing the it to thou, I, thou. And I remember that profoundly impacted me, because how I am seen and how I present myself is also reflective of the context and the dynamic and what exists between us. We are creating a new identity together. We are literally, like I say to these leaders, you are essentially nothing. And I don't mean that in a rude way. You are nothing without your people as a leader. Who are you leading if you're not leading people? And who are we if we're not in relationship with somebody and someone? I mean, yes, I can be sitting on a chair, but I'm not in relationship with it. It's that classic I, it. But I, thou, we exist in relationship with everyone we come across. And gosh, do we miss some real opportunities? So the hyphen has always been there ever since I've known Rob, and it's been amazing.
Yeah, I mean, any successful relationship, marriage relationship, will tell you that the hyphen is the key to all of this. And how much do you change because, and it comes so naturally to you, how much do you change because of your partner, of your spouse, of the one that you love? It comes so naturally to you, and yet we do not realize any of that. I mean, I was a very different person before I met with Irma. And over the period of time, I've seen me, becoming a different person, her becoming a different person. And I think that's the key to all happy relationship, all successful relationship. Probably the word understanding comes to mind. Yes, Rob, you want to say something? Yes.
I think of the umbilical cord.
Yes.
I think if you're looking for a physical joining, when you're joined to your mother, how much greater intimacy can you have than her blood flowing into you and enriching you, and your life and nerves flowing into her, and you're joined as one? What an amazing image, because it's very physical and we all know it, yeah? And Craig might be right. They probably think I exaggerate the hyphen, but I don't think there's anything more great. And my brother uses the word awesome. He says, when you finally discover meeting and you really know what meeting is, you're so co-joined with the other person that you're lost for words. He says, then you finally discover what it means for something to be awesome. You're in awe of that feeling, of that joining together.
Yes. And perhaps this is a good time to start, with the foundations in the hyphen, in the connection between the follower and the leader, or following and leading, to be more precise. Now is the time to probably expand on this model a little bit more, to say, what does that really mean within the leadership context? Craig, would you like to say a few words?
Happy to introduce it. I think Rob has the model we've developed and is going to fill it out. But fundamentally, what we did when we looked at a lot of models, they're like we looked at last time, the funnel models. So you've got the leader up the top and the followers down the bottom, and everything's flowing one way, and maybe the followers are going yay, yay, but it's that sort of thing. We shifted it much more to the side and had the follower and the leader in a zone of reciprocal relationship. Whereas a lot of the followership stuff just more or less says everybody's a leader, we're all lovely, everybody gets a participation prize. Whereas this was recognizing, no, that in most organizations a leader still has an authority and a role and so forth. But if they're in a reciprocal relationship, not just a one-way relationship, then the two are meeting. So the hyphen starts to get spelt out by what is happening in the reciprocal nature of what they're doing. And we highlighted particular aspects that we wanted to put in the book. I think our supplement is picking up some other things. Certainly from my side, having finished my PhD, I'm bringing in a whole lot of other team stuff that hasn't been there before. But in one sense, you could put almost anything in there that is related to a reciprocal relationship within a work environment. And again, that means when we're talking to people, quite often what we're asking them is, give us an example of where it works. And then they will give us something. May not have the same label that we're using, but it's something they've experienced where the leader and the follower have interacted and it's been positive and constructive, often called collaboration or whatever. But I think Rob has the actual guts of the model for us.
Do you want to see it, or will we? Okay.
Why don't we just talk about it? Yeah.
We decided in the book to basically magnify this hyphen and pull it out and expand it and say, well, it's a little dash and it looks like that. What would happen if we expanded out and looked at it, what actually is in it? One of my favourite words is the word mutual, that what happens in this zone, we've called the hyphen the zone of reciprocal relationship. It's just a phrase we used, but I like the idea of what do we share mutually. Well, okay, so there's Jenny, there's me. We don't share the same gender, but we share the same skin. We don't share exactly the same worldview, but we do share some common values. And so what the model does is it looks at what kind of things in this joining are mutual, and rather than looking as, I guess, a lot of people now in social media are looking for how they're different from others. Buber's book is in fact the reverse. What do we have in common? What do we share? What is mutual? And if I'm mutually connected to another human being, how on earth can I harm them or hurt them or want to turn them into an it, the I-it? How can I possibly want to turn them into an object when we share so much in common? And so Buber and the model that Craig and I put forward is the leader should be looking for what they're sharing in common with the follower, and the follower should be looking for what they're sharing in common with the leader as they meet. And so we do have this model, perhaps in the final product, Nip, and you can bring that model up in the podcast, in the visual podcast. But yeah, this idea of having things mutual and in common, and we named some of those things. We named things like we share an unconscious, we all share the will to learn, we all share a view of ethics and power, we all share a common sense of social contract, and we all share a sense of resilience. So there in the hyphen, those things we named, and if all leading and following looked at those 6 things, it would transform what leading and following was. So anyway, that's my brief.
And Jenny and I had a podcast just last week talking about connection and conversation, and the connection between connection and conversation. I think that was a fabulous conversation to bring in now, because what you're talking about is something that Jenny has. She told wonderful stories around that. So amazing things happen when we look at another person as a whole person and create a sense of connection. Jenny, would you like to add something to that? You have so much to share, I know.
I'm also conscious that this is not my model. I just love it. However, what it does open up for me now is if we take the context of safety into it. So many customers and various organizations are looking at ways to evolve. I'll use the word evolve loosely, what they're doing in the name of safety. And so many are throwing around the word, maybe we need to start caring. How do we care? And as you were talking, Rob, it reminded me that not that I'd like to replace the hyphen with the word care, because it's not the same. However, the secret is in the hyphen. How do I care? How can I care? If I don't know, if I don't find what brings us together and what mutually interests us beyond the fact that we work in the same facility and we share the same uniform and the logo. So it very much resonates around how do we translate the hyphen and how do we translate leader-follower into a real struggle that many organizations are having is, how do we care? And also, as I say that, is how many are actually asking themselves, how do I care? Not why do I care? How do I care?
By what method?
By what method, yeah. And I think when I look at this whole idea of I-thou or connection, the first time when Rob, you talked about it, the first thing that came to mind is that where is that connection? And I think the first connection is between the conscious and the unconscious, which is within the self. If you don't have a connection within the self, how can you connect with other people? How can you connect with the environment around you? And I think a lot of it is the result of losing connection with our own bodies, that we have ended up in a place where we don't feel the connection with other people. And I think that once you become connected with your own self, and you feel the pain within, it's only then you start to feel the pain and connection in other people and the environment around you. And I think a lot of people live life above the shoulders, as I say. They do not connect with themselves at all. and hence they don't find a connection with others. In fact, the whole idea becomes very absurd that if you have never sat in contemplation, if you have never listened to your body, if you have always treated your body like, with disrespect, how is it possible to see a connection with another human person or with the environment around you? I think that's a fundamental question, in my view, to address.
Yep, absolutely.
That links to some of my work, which is that I focused in my PhD on teams of mixed expertise. And part of what they spoke about was that teams fragment, often around areas that not are related to the work, but because they're made of different groups. So if I expand from Nippon's concept about the self to the most immediate group, so whether it be standard sociological things of gender, race, whatever, often it's not that. It can also just be there are a bunch of IT guys versus a bunch of legal guys, or a bunch of operators, or the one that always gets me when you get a group of construction people together is the Sparky is always the one that's on the outside. So that the team, even though it's made up, everyone's meant to be doing stuff, fragments into the smaller groups. And often the associations or the hyphen is really between the person within the team and outside of the team to the group that they feel associated with. And that is where I coined a term of collective coherence, that the group makes sense and it's coherent for that group. So that, for example, with going back to the Sparkies, one of the reasons why they're different is that they're often in their natural work dealing with high voltage, which is deadly. Whereas other construction form workers, there are risks, but it's not the same sort of thing. So there's a different way of viewing the world that is coherent for the Sparky that doesn't make sense to the other guys. So then within a following and leading environment, what we're needing to look at is to consider for the leader to consider the different collective coherences that are operating within the team and how do they relate to them and how do they help them relate to each other so that the mutuality that Rob spoke about is recognized even though they belong to different groups. A simple one for me was working on a hospital redevelopment where we got into risk registers. And all the different groups that were involved all had their own risk register. And I had them all in different, there's like 30 or 40 people in the room, all in teams. And they could not agree on a project risk register. And I said, why do we need to? You're doing that. So in the end, they came up with a traffic light system. A green was something that everybody had to have. Amber was something where you recognize that that's probably going to influence me, but it's not our main thing. And red was, we don't give a shit, but you do. So we need to take that into account. And we didn't create a new risk register. We created a traffic light system for identifying risks that were relevant to everybody. So it was a way of recreating a new zone of reciprocal relationship, even though each of the groups were still in their own thing.
Yeah, and part of that, Craig, is language. Is sometimes we find mutuality different because we can't speak or even share a common language with the other group. And so Sparkies speak in a certain way. And this is where leaders have to be very careful. If you're going to do leading and you're going to speak in leading language and leadership speak like, these military type leadership books that are out there, you can speak in that as much as you like, but you won't connect with anyone. And so the language you use, the very language we use, has to be the language that draws you into the hyphen, into connection. And the language has to connect with how the followers speak and see the world as well. So you need a common language and you need shared words. And I don't think people are that aware of that so much. And so you find these subcultures in organisations that struggle to come to mutuality because they can't even talk to each other.
Jenny, I'm just looking at these two very wise men talking and giving us so much to think about. And in the kind of world that we operate, you being a woman and I being a brown-skinned man, you can take the following leading model, following hyphen leading, you can put it into the realities of life, and it will quickly become a political weapon precisely
Mm.
because of its name. Because I've had people struggle with this whole idea that why should I be a follower and this person should be a leader? And I think it's very important, Jenny,
Mm.
that we think about these things because once it leaves my mouth, the word following leading, I have no idea how this is going to be implemented within the realities of what we face today in this world. What do you think, Jenny?
Oh, it is so true. And I think there's also, we've been talking about the hyphen. It creates a link, it speaks to connection, but it speaks to space, it speaks to time, it speaks to the world for a moment to stop and for us to just be. And I was reflecting with some leaders recently, leaders by name, recently, and one of them said, Jenny, a time in motion study, we did years ago, revealed that most leaders and most supervisors, after all things are said and done, probably only afforded 10 seconds every day to do this thing we call connect. So I think one of the challenges is, for some, there's a desire, but then the assumption is that to do it, we need space. We need to honor space and stillness and just being, and in a context that is very much about being efficient, being productive, not wasting time. And, if you are going to stop and just be, how can you create a business case for that to justify its existence? And so I think people feel unable to do it given the time they are afforded or they afford themselves. And then when they are given the time, it is uncomfortable because it is so foreign to many people. And we know, and I'm not very good at cliches, but I do remember distinctly that even though I can almost touch what amazement and beauty and wonder sits on the other side, the fact that I need to experience, hypothetically, 10 seconds of discomfort to finally touch and experience, that's too much. So we back away. So this constant game of I want to, but I don't. I want to, but I don't. And few venture into the space of actually let's traverse this hyphen together. So that's what strikes me as I listen to these wise men, Nitin. And Rob will tell you this is not a new idea, but I think very much in the world that we live in, that everything's time bound and time based and measured, and fewer people are valuing space and silence and just being together. And sometimes in the hyphen, the connection can be totally silent, and that's okay, but that's not rewarded and recognized and incentivized either. So it's a real paradox.
So on that, Jenny, have you found, what I found is trying to find stuff that helps them gradually move from where they are. So things like, I say to them, what is legitimate in your diary that nobody interrupts? And then saying, okay, well, we're going to relabel that time, that label. But it's not. Well, actually, it's the same priority. And so everybody will now understand that if it's, a meeting with the GM or whatever, or preparing strategy or whatever the term is, and they suddenly go, oh, okay, yeah, I can use that. So they know that it's not actually what you're talking about, but they also know that it's now making it equated and they can legitimize what they couldn't before.
Yeah, and this is something that we will build upon in our next podcast, where we talk about how to put this following leading model in practice. By the way, I have also experienced some aha moments as we start to give it a try. And as Jenny very rightly said, it's not the God in the current world, it's not the God to slow down and actually listen and connect with people. So it's something that sits outside of imagination, and one has to, give it an incremental try, as Craig said, and put it into some kind of ritual and see if it works. And when it works, it works. Heavens, we all know, four of us know that. But maybe this is a conversation we need to build upon when we meet next week, and take this forward. What do you think? Yeah, I think anything. Is there anything else that anyone wants to add or contribute?
I think
No.
that's a good place to stop.